Adoptive parents' pride and joy.
They'd do whatever they could to make me the happiest child.
They tried to give her everything. They adored her.
Their joy and adoration ended, however, when a star-crossed relationship came between daughter and parents.
It was her first relationship where she'd been involved in sexual activity.
They disliked me being with him. They saw it as bringing me down.
But just as their fears appeared to be confirmed,
Mom took her to the drugstore and got a pregnancy test.
their little girl would sink much, much lower.
911, do you have an emergency?
I just killed my mother.
May 14, 1997, Coral Springs, Florida. At 7:07 p.m., an Area 911 dispatcher received a chilling call.
Oh my God! Get the cops out here now!
Okay, they're coming.
He's dead, so I can't help her. I was in shock, just like trying to absorb the reality of the whole situation.
And the reality of the situation was shocking, to say the least. The dead woman was Nikki's own mother. And according to what Nikki told the 911 dispatcher, she had died at her daughter's hands.
How did you do that?
Repeatedly, there's blood over her and all over the floor and everything.
You could hear in her voice the terror, almost as if somebody else had done this.
But when the first officer arrived on the scene minutes later, Nikki took full responsibility for the crime.
I was screaming, telling them to come and arrest me.
For a young female juvenile to commit a homicide, that's a rare thing.
The search for answers would lead deep into the mind of a troubled teen.
She says, you know, I can't believe I'm so obsessed with a boy that I would do something like this.
I used to be like really religious and everything, and I used to live a really Christian life until I got involved with Carlos.
And Nikki's fate would hinge on the question of what mattered more, nurture.
They absolutely loved her to death, and I guess they felt she would reciprocate.
Or nature.
Mental illnesses have a strong genetic, predisposition.
Born in 1979, Jacqueline Nikki Reynolds had been 3 months old when her birth mother gave her up for adoption.
Didn't even know I was adopted until I was old enough to start asking questions.
Not that Nikki's adoptive parents, Robert and Billie Jean Reynolds, hid anything from their daughter.
My mom said that if I was ever ready, when I would turn 18 and wanted to find out who my biological mom was, and she would not keep that a secret from me.
They were a wonderful couple. They were wonderful parents. She was just their little girl that they adored.
A deeply religious couple, Robert Reynolds worked for the Florida Department of Transportation, while Billie Jean was an administrative assistant with R.J. Reynolds. From the very beginning, they did all they could to move heaven and earth for their beloved daughter.
They tried to give her everything. They were a church-going family. They adored her, and they treated her the way parents should treat a child.
It was probably a fairy tale lifestyle that I had as a kid. Very loving, never judgmental, never harsh on me.
Growing up in sunny South Florida, Nikki's bond with her parents only deepened over the years.
We'd go to the mall on Fridays, or I'd go have ice cream with my dad and baseball games with my dad and go shopping with my mom. They'd do whatever they could to make me the happiest child, which I was.
There was one thing Nikki's parents didn't do, however.
She was never told no. She was a spoiled brat. There's just no getting around that at all.
Spoiled or not, by the time Nikki entered her sophomore year of high school in 1995, the Reynolds' approach to parenting appeared to have paid off.
I always had good grades, went to after-school programs, was very involved with the church.
Between church, school, and extracurricular activities, Nikki Reynolds had grown into a well-rounded teenager. But she was no longer Robert and Billie Jean's baby girl.
I started to be more interested in boys.
Boys also began to take more of an interest in Nikki, which in the spring of 1996 led to trouble. It was late one afternoon in March when neighbor Patty Gertz noticed a police car outside the Reynolds house.
I had questioned Billy about it, and she had stated that Nikki had said that she had been raped.
According to Billie Jean, Nikki claimed she'd been assaulted that day after stepping off her school bus. But once the police were involved, her story had changed.
First it was somebody she knew, then it was somebody she didn't know.
Finally, Nikki ended up denying the entire allegation.
There was no rape. She'd made it up.
Why had she lied? According to Nikki, the truth was she had a new boyfriend, her first in one regard.
He was just my first person sexual-wise, so he brought me into a whole new world of emotions that I was unaware of. He was my world at that time.
Afraid she was pregnant, Nikki told police she'd cooked up the rape story to protect her boyfriend and her parents.
I didn't want to hurt them, being raised up in a church family, and I didn't want them to think that they had did anything wrong or raised me wrong.
Nikki wasn't pregnant, but to her church-going mother, that was little consolation for the news that her 16-year-old was sexually active.
That was really upsetting to Billy.
She was very angry with me. I basically threw my morals aside.
And just whom Billie Jean wanted to know had her daughter sacrificed her principles for. According to Nikki, he was a 16-year-old classmate named Carlos Infante.
I was in American history class with him, and we started by just hanging out in that class, getting to know each other, and then one thing led to another.
Had Carlos led Nikki astray? Her parents seemed to think so.
They disliked me being with him. They saw it as bringing me down.
Determined to get Nikki back on the straight and narrow, Billie Jean insisted she spend less time with Carlos and more time at church.
She thought the good kids were there at the church, that this would probably be a good influence on her to get in with a better group of kids.
But the more Billie Jean dragged her daughter to church, the more Nikki resisted.
I knew that the way I was living and everything was not right in God's eyes, but I didn't really want to hear all that.
Nikki also started to skip class. Soon her grades plummeted. By her junior year in high school, Robert and Billie Jean barely recognized the person their daughter had become.
Something just went wrong. You have a great kid, soft-spoken, seemed to me happy-go-lucky, and then she was making the bedroom dark, changing her music that she listened to. Just everything was opposite of what Nikki normally was.
I slept a lot, stayed in my room a lot, did not go out with the family. Nothing really held my interest.
Nothing, that is, but Carlos Infante.
After I became sexually involved with Carlos, my intensity level with him became like an obsession. Everything revolved around Carlos. I had pictures of him everywhere in the room. Every waking minute had to do with Carlos.
And she filled her diary with everything from confessions to poetry, all about Carlos.
She was in a situation where it was her first relationship where she'd been involved in sexual activity with anybody. So as a result of that, she, during that period of time, began to display behaviors she didn't display before.
Robert and Billie Jean were troubled by Nikki's new behavior and her new boyfriend.
I think they acted like any parent that loves their child and sees their child failing in their grades and in their classes. They were concerned.
Billy had said that, you know, he wasn't making good grades, he wasn't a good influence on Nikki, and she was worried that he was coming over every day.
Billie Jean did more than just worry. After years of permissive parenting, she suddenly started telling her daughter no. And Nikki took her mother's new approach more like a toddler than a teenager.
Nikki would go off on these tantrums, these screaming, yelling, like fits.
It was very wearing on Billy, and she just about had it, and she said she found herself screaming at Nikki all the time.
Billie Jean screamed in vain. Nikki remained determined to see Carlos, no matter what.
She would sneak out of her room at night when everybody went to sleep.
And the more her daughter disobeyed, the more exasperated Billie Jean became.
Billie Jean told me, you know, don't be surprised one day if you come home and there's police cars and fire trucks up and down the street, because I don't know if it's going to be me or Nikki, but one of us is going to be gone.
On May 14, 1997, Billie Jean received a phone call from the counselor at Nikki's high school. There was trouble with Nikki and Carlos.
The school counselor got involved with it, and the school counselor called Mom.
The meeting Billie Jean had with the school counselor that afternoon was brief, just long enough for the counselor to request that Billie Jean, Robert, and Nikki come in for a full session the following morning. The counselor explained that Nikki and Carlos had more than just the typical high school trouble to worry about. Nikki had confessed to the counselor that she was pregnant with Carlos's baby. Of course, considering Nikki had already lied about being raped, Billie Jean had reason to doubt her daughter's pregnancy. And there was a surefire way to find out.
Mom took her to the drugstore. They went and got a pregnancy test.
The test was negative, but the news didn't do much to soften Billie Jean's disappointment.
She was very upset, crying a lot. She was very angry with me.
While her mother raged, Nikki placed a call to Carlos to tell him the news.
I had decided to do that on my own, for one, wanting to see his reaction.
But she hadn't been on the phone long when her mother interrupted. Even though they had an appointment with the school counselor the next morning, Billie Jean wanted to consult a higher power.
Billie was adamant about her seeing the church counselor.
Billie Jean drove Nikki to the church. There, while mother and daughter waited to see the counselor, Nikki had a few brief words with her pastor, Herschel Kreisman.
She was having some boyfriend problems. I was there to be supportive to her.
The counseling session that followed wasn't so supportive, however.
The counselor, she started to raise her voice and tell me that my mom didn't deserve this, and it offended me. I got up, removed myself from her office, went outside into the parking lot, even contemplating running away at that time.
But Nikki didn't run away. Instead, she went back upstairs to the counselor's office and apologized to her mother. But was it the end of the fight? Or had she decided to take a new approach? At 7:07 p.m. on the evening of May 14th, barely an hour after returning home from her short session with the church counselor, Nikki Renoylds picked up the phone and dialed 911.
911, do you have an emergency?
I just killed my mother.
You just killed your mother?
Yes, I did.
When police arrived moments later, they found Nikki waiting on her doorstep.
She had blood all over her, blood on her legs, blood on her face.
Coming up, in the interrogation room, Nikki reveals the disturbing truth behind her mother's death.
I told her everything, like, I'm sorry, I have to kill you.
At just after 7 p.m. on May 14, 1997, Coral Springs police and EMT vehicles were lined up outside the home of 17-year-old Nikki Renoylds. Minutes earlier, the teen had dialed 911 and confessed to committing a crime of unimaginable horror.
I stabbed her repeatedly in the back. There's blood over her and all over the floor.
A teenage girl confessing to stabbing someone over and over was shocking enough. But what most astounded investigators was the identity of her victim.
She had killed her mother. I don't know anybody that just can fathom killing their own mother.
Nikki was handcuffed and put into the back of a police car.
The police officer at the scene had turned on a tape recorder and left it on the seat. She had been taped talking to herself.
I was praying the entire time I was in that cop car.
Oh, God. Please be alive. Please. Please, 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 please. Oh, please be alive, God. I've learned my lesson so bad.
And Nikki was still praying moments later when the paramedics arrived.
I remember seeing them bring her out on a stretcher with the IV attached to her, and I remember thinking in my head, okay, she's not covered up. And I remember actually feeling a lot of hope.
Nikki's hopes and prayers were no use. Stabbed 13 times, Billie Jean Renoylds was pronounced dead at 8:10 p.m.
She died by bleeding to death because there were so many stab wounds.
Nikki was transported to the Coral Springs Police Department. Moments later, her father arrived home from church to find his house surrounded by police cars and crime scene tape.
The father just completely broke down and collapsed right there on the street. He couldn't believe that his wife was gone. And he couldn't believe that his daughter did this.
And this homicide had been particularly brutal, if the scene inside the house was any indication.
There was blood all over the place inside the house.
The mother tried to get away from her. It was just a trail of blood.
There had been no escape. The blood trail traced Billie Jean Reynolds' harrowing death, dragging herself across the floor as she was stabbed again and again.
A knife is in the sink. It was like a kitchen knife and had some blood on it.
In the kitchen, not far from where they'd found the knife, police found evidence that someone had attempted to clean up the crime scene.
On the countertop, there was a couple bloody towels and dish rags that looked like somebody had been smearing, trying to wipe blood up off the floor.
While police worked the crime scene, detectives at the Coral Springs Police Department questioned Nikki about the murder. And they didn't have to press too hard for answers.
I had no intentions of lying. I didn't have any secrets. I wanted to get it out.
It was so simple because she just chatted away. All I had to ask her was, Nikki, you know, what happened today? Can you describe to me what happened? And she just went through the whole story from A to B.
It was a story that, according to Nikki, centered on her boyfriend, Carlos Infante. Nikki said it all began that afternoon when the school counselor called her mother.
Mom came there to the school. That's when Mom found out that she was pregnant.
At least that's what Nikki had told Carlos.
There would be times when Carlos would break up with me, and I would claim to be pregnant, and he would stay with me. I lied to him, so then I figured I couldn't live without him.
But that afternoon, she'd called Carlos from home and told him the truth. There was no baby.
That's when he got all mad at me. He did not want anything to do with me anymore because of all the lies.
Then, according to Nikki, an extraordinary thing happened. Billie Jean Reynolds had gotten on the phone with Carlos.
She apologized to him for having me put him through all the stuff I put him through.
For his part, Carlos had made it clear that he was only angry with Nikki, not Billie Jean.
He was apologizing to her for all the drama and everything.
But the drama had been far from over. Nikki told police that after she got off the phone with Carlos, she had decided to kill someone.
I took a glass jar full of cotton balls, emptied out the cotton balls, filled it with water, and took out an aspirin bottle out of my parents' medicine cabinet and started to shove as many pills as I could in my hand and just kept swallowing it.
Expecting death at any moment, she'd accompanied her mother to the counseling session at Coral Springs Baptist Church.
When she took me to see the lady for the first time, I had already overdosed and thought that I was going to be dead that day.
But when the overdose seemed to have no effect, Nikki told detectives that her thoughts turned from suicide to homicide. But the intended victim wasn't her mother.
The thoughts started changing that if I get to school to Carlos the very next day, then I can most likely kill him. If I couldn't have him, no one could.
Well, my plan to kill Carlos was to wait till he comes out of his first shower, come up behind him, and slit his throat.
There was, as Nikki told the detectives, one obstacle in the way: the meeting with her high school guidance counselor.
I was thinking, well, I don't know how I'm going to do this because I don't know after the meeting if they're going to say, well, take your daughter home.
To kill Carlos as planned, Nikki would have to skip the guidance meeting. But how?
I figured, well, I'll just wait till my parents are sleeping and then I'll slash their throats.
But the plan changed when her father left for church after supper that night, alone.
Her father was at church. Her mother decided not to go on that particular evening.
And Nikki wasn't going anywhere either.
My mom told me I was grounded for the rest of the night. She told me to just clean up the dishes.
According to Nikki, as she stood over the sink that night, she'd started plotting.
I started cleaning the dishes, and from there, the thoughts started changing.
I figured this even makes it easier for me if I kill my mom and then clean up the mess and wait till my dad gets home. Then I'll kill him, and then I'll drive to school tomorrow, and then I'll kill Carlos.
All logical thinking was out the door at this time. Whatever thought went through my head, that's what I acted on, not thinking of consequences.
The plan laid out. All she needed was opportunity. It had come, according to Nikki, not long after she finished the dishes.
I was acting up like I was cleaning the kitchen. My mom started working at the computer. It was what I tried.
In gory detail, Nikki walked the detectives through what had happened next.
She said she went to the kitchen, she pulled out a kitchen knife and she rubbed it along her finger to feel if it was sharp enough to do the job.
According to what Nikki told police, she hesitated once she had the knife in hand.
And the only time it started scaring me was when I was actually thinking about when I was cleaning up the kitchen to kill my mom, and I had the knife, I was shaking, and feeling like that I didn't know what to do.
Her hesitation didn't last long.
I finally got the nerve to come behind her, and I tried to slash her throat. And it didn't exactly cut. She started screaming, and she jumped up towards the laundry room. She's like, "No, Nikki, no."
That's when, according to Nikki, she struck.
I kept stabbing her and everything like that, and I told her, "I'm sorry, I have to kill you because I can't live without Carlos."
I asked her why I was doing this. I asked her to help me stop, and I could not. I felt like I was watching it other than doing it.
But if she wanted to stop, why did she continue to stab her mother?
The thoughts that kept going through my head was, if you stop now, she's gonna suffer. And if you love her, why would you let her suffer? Why wouldn't you hurry up and send her to God?
I kept asking her, "Are you dying? Are you dying?" And I was crying because I felt so bad. I couldn't believe what I was doing.
You were asking her, "What are you, what?
Are you dying? Are you dying?"
Eventually, Billie Jean ceased to struggle.
Her mother says the life is going out of me, and she said I stabbed her 3 or 4 more times until she stopped moving.
But, Nikki told detectives, Billie Jean offered her daughter forgiveness, even as she lay dying.
The last thing that really stands out to me is that she said that she just wanted me to get help and that she did love me.
Her mother's dying words, she explained to police, finally made her realize what she'd just done. And as the awful impact sank in, she'd panicked.
I felt in my mind that I can erase it. So I had attempted to basically start cleaning up the mess.
There was, however, one thing she couldn't erase, no matter how hard she tried.
When I had turned and saw her lying on the floor, it just felt like a huge smack in the face of almost like an awakening of reality. And immediately I picked up the phone.
911, do you have an emergency?
I just killed my mother.
The confession caught on 911 tape was damning enough, even without the chilling details added by Nikki's interrogation.
It really kind of spoke for itself, the confession.
And although Nikki had just confessed to murder, her next confession would keep her from spending that night behind bars.
During the interview, Nikki said that she had ingested some aspirin, and I guess in an attempt to commit suicide.
I was very sick being from the pills, started throwing up, and then they took me from there to the emergency room.
But Nikki's short hospital stint didn't mean she was off the hook.
I was at the hospital with her for quite a while, stood post by her until the doctors would release her to go to the county jail.
Later that night, Nikki was formally booked on first-degree murder charges.
It's almost like Monopoly, you know? Go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200.
Coming up, could Nikki's suicide attempt amount to a get-out-of-jail-free card?
Aspirin has a significant potential for causing metabolic derangement.
On April 14, 1999, 19-year-old Nikki Renoylds was escorted into a Fort Lauderdale courtroom to stand trial for murder.
Her face just looked like a baby. She was just so young to be accused of what she had been accused of.
Nikki had spent almost 2 years in a juvenile correctional facility awaiting trial, and what she was accused of was horrendous.
She stabbed her mother to death. Stabbed her many, many times, not just one time.
The defendant stops and then says, "Are you dying yet? Are you dying yet?" And her mother says, "Yes, I feel the life fading out of me."
If convicted of the crime, Nikki faced life in prison. But why would the baby-faced teen commit such a heinous act? The answer, according to the prosecutor's opening statement, centered around a boy named Carlos Infante.
She just wanted to be with him, that's all there was to it.
That didn't mean he'd been involved, however. The prosecution pointed out that Carlos not only had an alibi, he was also one of the 3 people Nikki had set out to kill on the night of May 14th, 1997.
She had it all planned out. Mom was first, and she was going to go on to Dad next, and then her boyfriend.
In their open, Nikki's defense team didn't dispute the state's charge that their client had committed the crime, but they argued that Nikki was innocent by reason of insanity.
Insanity made perfect sense to me because of how I felt, being that I couldn't believe it happened.
It seemed pretty clear that Nikki had done something that was quite out of character for her. It did seem to me as though there was a really strong case for insanity.
But was the case strong enough for Nikki to escape life in prison?
The definition of insanity is very strict. You have to suffer from a major mental disorder, and you have to not know that what you were doing was wrong, not know the consequences of it, not know the nature of it.
Did Nikki know what she was doing when she plunged a knife into her mother 13 times? The answer, according to the psychologist who testified for the prosecution, was yes.
She was a confused girl, very conflicted, had some personality problems, but under the definition of the law, she did not meet the legal criteria for insanity.
Nikki, according to the prosecution, had knowingly committed murder. The proof, they claimed, was in the statement she gave to police just hours after killing her mother. On April 15th, prosecutors called the detectives who'd taken Nikki's statement to the stand.
Nikki Renoylds knew exactly what she was doing. I always thought it was premeditated because she thought about how she was going to do it.
Jurors didn't have to take the detective's word for it either. Nikki's entire interrogation had been captured on tape.
I figured this even makes it easier for me if I kill my mom and then clean up the mess and wait till my dad gets home. Then I'll kill him, and then I'll drive to school tomorrow, and then I'll kill Carlos.
She walked her way through the whole incident, her plans on how she did it.
And the planning, according to the prosecution, started hours before Billie Jean's death. As proof, prosecutors called Nikki's pastor, Herschel Kreisman, to testify.
The pastor testified that he had spoken with Nikki several hours before the murder.
They'd spoken on the afternoon of May 14th, 1997, when Billie Jean brought her daughter in to see the church counselor.
She asked him, "Can I still go to heaven if I've done something bad?"
Had it been a veiled reference to the horrible crime Nikki was hours away from committing? Not according to Nikki's defense attorney. He argued that there was a perfectly rational answer for his client's statement.
I felt like I was going to die from the overdose.
And the same religious upbringing that led Nikki to consider suicide a mortal sin was front and center when the defense started presenting its case on April 26th.
The rest of her life wasn't spent stabbing people, hitting people with sticks, running around with guns.
Nikki was a sweet girl, very soft-spoken, very quiet, always smiling, saying hello. Before Billie was killed, something happened. Something snapped.
But what had caused Nikki's sudden change from a good girl to a killer? Her defense team argued that underneath Nikki's sweet exterior was a mental illness that had finally surfaced with tragic results.
The defense was trying to show that she could not appreciate the wrongness of what she was doing.
I couldn't understand, even though I had committed a violent crime. I still want to sit here and say I'm not this violent person. I don't understand it just as much as anybody else doesn't understand it.
To bolster their case, Nikki's defense attorney called in psychiatric experts to testify that Nikki suffered from borderline personality disorder.
Individuals with borderline personality disorders can adore and idealize the person that they're with and then very quickly snap into one of feeling rejected and overwhelmed with extreme rage and anger.
Could Nikki's breakup with Carlos Infante have sent her spiraling out of control?
They certainly were presenting that she had snapped at the time, that something had happened to her that caused her to do something temporarily that she would not ordinarily have done.
It all has to do biologically with what I struggle with mental illnesses, borderline personality disorder.
At the time of the actual event, I do not believe that her brain was functioning normally.
But Nikki's personality disorder wasn't all the defense claimed as the cause of Billie Jean's death. There was also the aspirin.
Aspirin has a significant potential for causing metabolic derangements within the body. The overdose of the aspirin caused her to have a mini psychotic episode.
Under what her attorneys claimed was the aspirin's mind-altering influence, Nikki may have planned out a series of murders. But the defense also reminded jurors that it was the horrible aftermath of the first killing that had shocked the teenager to her senses.
She got snapped back to reality when she saw her mother's body.
That's what the defense claimed, at least. But on April 29th, it would be up to the jury to decide not whether or not Nikki committed murder, but whether her alleged insanity was enough to excuse it.
Nobody was denying what took place here. Nobody was denying how horrific it was. Her sanity was the only issue that was at stake.
Coming up, the jury retires to consider a verdict. But would its decision mark the end of this case, or just the beginning?
Do you acknowledge being the biological mother of the defendant in this case, Jacqueline Nicole Reynolds?
Yes, I am.
On May 3rd, 1999, 19-year-old Nikki Reynolds sat in a Broward County courtroom facing an uncertain future. Charged with the first-degree murder of her adoptive mother, her only chance to avoid a lengthy prison sentence rested on one thing.
The central question wasn't whether or not she did it. The central question was whether or not she was sane when she did it.
Nikki's defense attorney had argued that his client wasn't. But would a jury agree?
That's a very difficult thing for a juror who's a layman to be able to say, well, can somebody so disassociate themselves that they don't know right from wrong?
Just how difficult became clear on May 3rd when jurors sent a note to the presiding judge. They were hopelessly deadlocked, 6 in favor and 6 against a conviction.
The judge asked them to go back in and make a decision once again.
It was no use.
You had 2 mental health professionals on the defense saying she was insane, and 2 doctors for the state saying she was not insane. What the jury did was they compared the 2 and said, we need a tiebreaker.
The showdown came 6 months later, when both sides reconvened for a second trial in the same Florida courtroom on November 1st, 1999. As they had in the first trial, prosecutors contended that Nikki Reynolds fully intended to kill her mother when she'd picked up the knife on the evening of May 14th, 1997.
That's a day that when the voice of Billie Jean Reynolds was silenced prematurely, but forever silenced. Her voice was silenced by none other than her daughter, Jacqueline Nicole Reynolds.
Next, hoping to defuse Nikki's insanity defense, prosecutors once again called a series of psychologists to the stand. And each expert repeated the previous argument that while hardly a rational act, killing her mother didn't automatically prove Nikki was insane.
In this case, you have an individual who clearly showed her ability to discriminate wrongfulness by looking at the situation, thinking about it, and even testing ahead of time the knife to see whether or not it was sharp enough.
She knew what she was doing. She knew she was stabbing her mother. She knew that she was killing her mother, and she knew that that was wrong.
And Nikki, according to prosecutors, did more than just weigh right and wrong before picking up the knife. They claimed her mother's death was clearly premeditated.
It wasn't a rash, impulsive behavior where her and her mother get into an argument. She's so upset, she just pulls out a knife and starts to stab her. I mean, she planned the timing of it, and she planned what was going to happen after it.
As in the first trial, the defense countered by arguing that Nikki was indeed mentally ill. And like the prosecution, the defense called experts to testify as to Nikki's sanity or lack of it.
We don't even know whether she fully understood when she was attacking this person, whether in her mind this person was really her loving mother, or whether this person was now the enemy.
In my head, it basically told me if you kill your mom, then you can still get to Carlos, not thinking this is my mom that loves me and wants me.
Although, as the defense reminded jurors, Billie Jean Reynolds wasn't Nikki's biological mother. It was the setup for a new witness, someone who hadn't testified in Nikki's first trial. Someone, in fact, Nikki hadn't seen since she was 3 months old.
Do you acknowledge being the biological mother of the defendant in this case, Jacqueline Nicole Reynolds?
Yes, I am. My attorney contacted a private investigator who contacted the adoption agency I was adopted from, and from there they found her.
The defense hadn't marched Katrina Ramos into the courtroom for a family reunion, however. She was there to establish beyond a doubt that Nikki did indeed suffer from mental illness. The proof, according to the defense, lay within Ramos's own well-documented psychiatric history.
She suffered from mental illness, a long history of mental illness.
Katrina Ramos also admitted to a history of family violence. Although in her case, the target wasn't her mother. It had been her unborn child, the child now on trial for murder.
Her mother testified that during her pregnancy, she repeatedly tried to induce a miscarriage. She punched herself in the stomach. She fell on her stomach. She was trying to lose this baby.
Nikki appeared shaken by the news.
Nikki was fighting back tears when her mother was testifying about her efforts to get rid of Nikki when she was pregnant with her.
Did the same mental illness that drove Nikki's birth mother to try to abort her unborn child lead to Billie Jean's death?
To understand what type of illness someone may have, you just have to shake the family tree and see what falls out.
The mother did have similar psychiatric issues as those that Nikki had.
It's all the same line of behaviors, and that was important for our defense.
And according to that defense, it was the anxiety over losing Carlos that pushed Nikki's borderline personality disorder into psychosis.
At the time of the crime, she had lost touch with reality, and she was experiencing problems with her thinking. She thought that she had to kill her mother and her father because they were going to prevent her from killing Carlos the next day at school.
Why did you find that to be evidence, if you did, of psychosis or psychotic-like features?
Because it doesn't really make any long-term sense. It's not necessary for her to kill her parents in order to kill Carlos, as crazy as killing Carlos is.
But did that prove Nikki was truly insane? The prosecutors didn't think so. In their closing arguments on November 17th, they hammered that point home by playing Nikki's own words from her 911 tape.
I can't believe I did this to her.
Okay, Nikki, everything's going to be okay, all right?
It is not. I'm going to see the electric chair.
She was confused. She wasn't thinking logically, but she wasn't irrational.
In fact, mere hours after the killing, during her interrogation, Nikki was rational enough to start offering up excuses. It was the same excuse prosecutors reminded the jury that her attorneys had spent the last several days presenting.
This has never happened before. That's why I think I need to. I don't know. What do they do when you plead insanity?
On November 19th, 1999, 20-year-old Nikki Reynolds sat in a Fort Lauderdale, Florida courtroom, awaiting a verdict in her second murder trial.
The thoughts that kept going through my head waiting for the verdict was basically trusting in the Lord and knowing it was in His hands.
One jury had already tried and failed to reach a verdict. Would a second?
Mr. Foreperson, have you arrived at a verdict?
Yes, sir, we have.
The trial offered jurors a choice between two mothers. The biological one the defense claimed had passed her mental illness on to her daughter, and the one who'd adopted Nikki as an infant. Could one cancel out the other? And if so, which?
We, the jury, finds as follows as to the indictment of this defendant in this case. Defendant is guilty of the lesser included crime of murder in the second degree.
To find somebody guilty of second-degree murder, there has to be ill will or like hatred towards the victim. And I remember my reaction being very upset when I was found guilty. There's no evidence of hate towards my mother or that I wanted her dead. There's no evidence of that.
At her sentencing hearing on January 7, 2000, Nikki's biological mother, Katrina Ramos, made a passionate plea on behalf of her 20-year-old daughter.
I am asking you to consider treatment as a part of Nikki's sentencing. I believe that Nikki can turn her life around as well and be a productive member of society.
Then, for the very first time, Nikki addressed the court.
I don't know what happened. I didn't mean to hurt any of you. And whether you believe me or not, I swear to God, I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't mean to tear the family apart.
I made a statement asking them to forgive me and understand that I did not mean this and I did not hate my mom or any of my family for that matter, not even Carlos.
Next, Nikki begged the judge to sentence her to a psychiatric hospital in lieu of prison.
Things like this don't just happen, and I believe that there's something has to be wrong. And if it was not insanity, something was wrong that day.
Although the way the judge saw it, the horrible wrong Nikki had committed outweighed all else. That afternoon, he gave Nikki the maximum sentence under Florida law, 34 years in prison.
A child who could have had a nice full life and enjoyed her life with her family now will always look back and realize she's got a shattered family.
And for Nikki, losing her family, not losing Carlos, was the ultimate price.
These are the consequences of my crime. I just want people to learn from my experience, teenagers and maybe other kids that struggle with codependency or feeling like their boyfriend is their life and they can't go on, that of course that's not true.